Well, hello. I'm glad to welcome this morning the Reverend Tuck Bartholomew, who is our new canon for church planting. We are really excited about Tuck and about what God has in store for all of us together. And we wanted to take a few minutes this morning just to introduce you to him and to let you get to know him a little bit as he begins his ministry among us. So, Tuck, welcome to the Diocese of the Mid-Atlantic. Why don't you just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, about your family, and then I'll just ask some questions as they occur to me, okay?
Sure, yeah, really glad. It's good to be here. I'm excited about the new role and glad that it's finally public and can confirm that I'm a real person and not merely an idea. Um, so I'm Tuck Bartholomew. I pastor a church currently in Philadelphia called City Church Philadelphia. I've been here for the last 15 years. I'm married to Stacy, and we have three children, Connor, Tucker, and Emmeline, and they are adults in their 20s, living in different parts of the United States. I am really excited about this particular next chapter. I've had a long time affinity for Anglicans and glad that the Lord has worked out a way for me to bring some of the gifts and skills that I have as a church planter and interest in clergy formation and leadership development to the diocese. So excited about that opportunity.
I know from getting to know you how much being a father, being a parent means to you. And I've just been impressed as I've heard you talk about your family and your family life, just what a central place that has for you. So I wonder if you could talk about, what is it about being a parent that's so special?
I like being a parent. Let's put it that way. Let's begin there. That's a good place to start. Um, yeah, I think when I think about my own life with the Lord, and I think being a dad has taught me many things about new and fresh ways of imagining and understanding how God loves us as His children. I would say I grew up in a more complicated family background, so I've delighted to be a dad and to express that and experience that a little differently than I grew up with it, honestly. And very often it's been those soft moments with my kids, with each of them, when you express compassion toward them, and it becomes a lens through which you see, oh, this is how God relates to us. One of my favorite sayings from a mentor of mine, Tim Keller, whom I used to work with at Redeemer in New York, he often would throw out the comment, "You're only as happy as your least happy child," which has been something that's been an interesting thing to think about as I've walked with my children through different stages of their lives, and understand how my heart as a father, as a parent, is drawn toward them in their need. And again, just being a parent has been a great lens through which to begin to reimagine a healthier way of thinking of who God is and how He relates to us and loves us.
That's great. Well, you mentioned Tim Keller, and so I want to kind of dive into that a little bit because for those of us in our diocese that are not as familiar with church planting as you and I are, let me just say that Tim, I consider to be the leading voice in church planting in our country. He's been a mentor to many of us and has helped to really define what it means to plant churches in our context and to engage American culture with the gospel. Um, so what I want to do is just to ask a little bit about that connection, how you met Tim, how you came to work on staff with him at Redeemer, and just what that relationship has been like for you over the years.
Sure, yeah. So I met Tim back in the I guess the late 1980s. He was a professor at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where I was attending. And he was just beginning to do research on the Redeemer Church plant. He wasn't originally cited to be the church planter, but he was doing sort of reconnaissance work. And that's the context in which I met him and heard him talk about what he was discovering about New York culture and some of the opportunities. I was deeply curious as a seminarian about that, and very drawn to questions of contextual theology and how do we enter more complex situations, particularly secular situations. The city was still generally considered a rather frightening space for many people, and so Tim opened up a door for people to imagine life in the city a little differently, and imagine themselves living Christianly in that space. I left seminary and went and worked on a PhD in sociology. Redeemer actually became a part of my work in that dissertation effort. And so Tim and I stayed connected over the years. I started my pastoral vocation in South Carolina as a PCA minister there, working with a gentleman named Joe Novenson, who had profound influence on my life as well. And then went from there to Charlottesville, Virginia. And then as I was finally finishing up my dissertation, I was an ABD category for quite some time. Tim reached out and just inquired as to whether or not Stacy and I would be interested in relocating our family to the city. And we actually relocated a month after 9/11, so in October of 2001. And I never considered myself a church planner. I never had aspirations of being a church planner. I just assumed that my trajectory vocationally would be pretty normal. I would be an assistant pastor, an associate pastor, and move on into the space of a senior role someday. One of the things that happened for me and in the Redeemer context was just an awakening for church planning, and that's because Redeemer does a lot of that and has been a participant in a lot of that, and certainly a lot of their missional effort has been in the realm of church planning, particularly in global cities. And I was eager to see if maybe I could try that. And we explored different options of where we might plant a church, and we landed in Philadelphia because of some historic connections that we had here, some possibilities of continuing to work with Westminster Seminary, and particularly connections down in the city near the University of Pennsylvania. And so we relocated here in 2006 after 5 years in New York, and we've been here ever since.
As a church planter, one of the things that I think is so precious about it and such a privilege is being able to start something new and something fresh, and something that really you have a big hand in building the culture of that entity. And I remember in one of the documents that you wrote for us during the interview process, you talked about enacting and embodying many of the things that you learned to value over the years in the church plan. I wonder if you could talk about that for us, because I think that gives a window into you and into church planting in general.
As a church planner, you have a lot of opportunity to shape that. You're not inheriting institutional baggage or institutional practices that have been in a church for a long period of time. You rather, you more or less have your hand in the wet cement or the wet clay of the plant and get to shape it. So for me, some of those deciding influences had been, obviously there's a strong emphasis, on solid biblical preaching, and those are things that I've valued, since my earliest days as a seminarian, but cultivated over time in very missional contexts within the PCA. So what does that mean to sort of be committed to biblical theological preaching, but not necessarily that's only doing that in the context of a highly churched setting or among highly churched people. The calling of the church is to embody the very presence of Christ in the world, and that's more than preaching, and it can't be reduced to preaching. It's an experience of Christian community, and particularly Christian community in its life together that's on mission together in a place. And so a church plant gives you an opportunity to begin to define some of those dimensions. So the embodiment of the gospel is as important as what we have to say about the gospel. And so City Church has been a place where we've practiced hospitality well. We've as a core way in which we're trying to know one another, and in which we're trying to know our neighbors, and engage in the needs of the city. Even one of the things that happens in churches, and particularly churches that have been around for a long time, um, I think it's fair to say I haven't always served in those churches, right? So whether I was a pastor in South Carolina that had been a church plant, I was serving under the second pastor of that church. It was a church of about 600 or 700, and then in Charlottesville, Virginia, similarly, I was the pastor under the second of the church of the pastors of that church. And similarly in New York, Redeemer was still pastored by Tim, but it was, still a pretty young church as churches go. But one of the things that Tim often commented on is that he felt that Redeemer was often reinventing itself every 5 to 10 years. That every 5 years, there's a kind of turnover and churn, both in terms of attendance, but just having to reinvent its engagement, its missional engagement with the community. And that was a really helpful frame for me as I've thought about my work as a church planter, and and as I've come alongside of churches that struggle. That are older and have found that they've lost connection missionally with the community. So how do we bring this sort of this willingness to constantly reinvent ourselves in the new and emerging context in which our churches find themselves and our people find themselves, really?
It's great, Chuck. I think you're touching on something that's really important, especially for us in our diocese today. Um, the kinds of changes that you're talking about are all around us in our culture. And I think the question of staying engaged with our culture and being able uh, to make the necessary changes that we need to make to stay engaged and to stay in touch while keeping the message the same is the paradox that I think we have to live in. And so I think your experience with Redeemer, your experience with City Church in Philadelphia, is going to be enormously helpful to us, especially during this next season, as we try to figure out what does it mean to be the church in a post-COVID world.
Mm.
Lots of things are changing, and we're learning a lot right now, but we have a lot yet to learn. So I think it's very, very helpful time to think about engaging those ideas. Now you are actually connected with several seminaries, and you're teaching about these kinds of things as well, which is I think a wonderful way to be able to sort of draw back out of parish ministry, because parish ministry can be a vortex, and you can be so drawn into it that you don't step back from it and look at the bigger picture. But when you're involved in seminary education and you're working with folks who are going to be stepping into those roles, you do have to look at it through a different lens. So I thought it would be helpful for people to know a little bit about your teaching background, about the kinds of things that you're focused on with your students, where you're teaching and so forth. Maybe you could
Sure.
talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, so since I completed the PhD, a number of years ago, and really when I moved back to Philly in 2006, I had the opportunity to begin to teach in an adjunct way with Westminster Seminary, and I did so teaching like Doctrine of the Church courses, and preaching was a primary focus as well there. I've that sort of I've transitioned to a variety of seminaries over the years, and I've taught with a seminary called Redeemer Theological Seminary in Dallas, where I taught ethics, and also taught philosophy of ministry, particularly with regard to Center Church. And then more recently, I've been teaching with Missio Seminary, a local seminary here in Philadelphia, on organizations and change, and then also with Western Theological Seminary, which is my denomination's seminary in Holland, Michigan, where I've taught church planting a number of times, and I've taught currently teaching a course on contextual theology this term called Gospel. gospel culture and church. So I've enjoyed staying connected to students. I've enjoyed having to stay connected in the context of a teaching environment. Um, one of the ways there's a little synergy that develops, I think, for myself and in that work, and also for the church, is I've had the benefit of bringing back fresh ideas to the church as I interact with students and other faculty members, but also pulling into the seminary context the congregational experience. And hopefully it will help me in this new role just have a sense of how to identify new leaders and how to create leadership pipelines and participate in identifying new church planters.
I think the whole aspect of leadership pipeline is crucial for us in church planting, because it is one of the limiting factors for us if we can't find those folks who feel called to it and are very excited about it. I know that you have given a lot of thought to that, and one of the passions I think that we share is being able to find those younger clergy or seminarians who are in their early stages of developing their identity as ministers, and walking alongside of them and helping them to clarify their call and what they're going to be doing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that process and how you engage in that. I think that's going to be so important for your work with us.
My experience with it is more in the context of being the church planter. There's that reality to it. So my experience here has been the benefit of having a regular pattern of internships and engagement with internships with young clergy, or emerging clergy, probably would be a better description of them. But so creating spaces where men and women can serve in the church as they're in seminary, and then post seminary, more residency type experiences. So I've often felt that our seminaries need some intermediary process, and so teaching churches, if you will, like a teaching hospital, can be a very important space for leadership formation. I think at City Church here, I think there's about 6 pastors that have directly sort of gone through an ordination process under us in the Philadelphia region, and more that have been a part of us and moved on to other places and found themselves in ordination. But the benefit of being a church that's connected to students in seminary ministry or seminary education is that you give a very different context for the things that they're learning. You give a very practical outlet for them to think about the usefulness of the things they're learning, whether that's a theological course or a biblical studies course, or certainly the practical theology courses. You're creating context for people to learn, and then of course that's most beneficial when you actually give them real work to do, and you're processing that work with them. I've loved being a part of becoming a resource church in that regard, even though we're not a huge one, but we've participated in that work very intentionally. And I would love to see, as many churches in the diocese that would like to imagine what it would be like to have a regular internship program, that maybe we even facilitate learning groups across parishes, because you may not have enough interns internal to your own parish to do that well. But I'd love to begin to think creatively about how we do that so that we are nurturing a next generation of leaders, which is critical to the church. And it's easy, I think, too, just another piece of commentary here. It's very easy as a pastor to be consumed with the work at hand, right? We have budgets that have to be met. We have funding goals. We have, the ordinary ministry of parish work, and it can be all consuming, and so it's easy to let the leadership development pieces, or particularly as it relates to clergy development, be a sideline piece or be in specialized churches. And that's something that I'm very committed to, is serving the future, particularly as I move out of parish ministry directly and I move into the space of, you know, development and clergy formation and church planning formation. I feel in this next stage of my life vocationally that I've been prepared to focus on a next generation of leaders, and it's really what I'm very committed to doing. And I think that's the gift that I have to give to the church of the future.
Yeah.
And I'm excited about that opportunity, and excited to be doing it with Doma.
Well, it's one of the many ways that there's such a good fit, such an alignment between you and your experience and the things that you're passionate about and the vision that God's given to us. We have been very excited in recent years about this vision to plant 50 churches in the next 10 years, and we've already planted the first few, and we've got a couple more in the pipeline. But to reach a goal like that is really dependent on having the right people to do the planting, and having the leadership development piece in place in our diocese, where our churches are sort of incubating those leaders, if you will, in the ways that you're talking about, is absolutely critical. And so I'm excited that you're excited about that, because that's a way that I think there's a lot of synergy between us.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I've sensed that as well.
You mentioned that you were ordained in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America. I know that you grew up as a Southern Baptist and then transitioned during college years to the PCA, and then more recently now are in the Reformed Church of America.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in all there, you began to be drawn to Anglicanism, and so that's very much something that we're very excited about. But I'd like you to talk about that. What's that been like for you? How's that happened?
Yeah, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. Just in terms of my childhood, I grew up in the South. I grew up from Raleigh, North Carolina originally, and then spent the latter part of my teenage years and college years in Atlanta, Georgia. So Southern Baptist was the root space. During college, just by some stroke of, I guess, providence, I ended up not in the BSU, the Baptist Student Union. I ended up in a more independent college ministry that I later would go on and work with as a campus minister. But in that space was where I was introduced to more Reformed theological perspectives, and started making the shift toward a Presbyterian form of governance and church practice. The major influences for me were people like Francis Schaeffer and the Ministry of Liberty Fellowship, where I actually spent some time, particularly the group up in Southborough, Massachusetts. The shift to Anglicanism probably started as early as college, because it was in that context that we were all reading John Stott and J.I. Packer. I mean, and so theologically, biblically, and particularly, Stott had a much broader reach beyond sort of even his biblical studies emphasis. He wrote a lot about culture and how the church might engage cultural problems and cultural questions and questions of economic justice and things like that. So, Stott and Packer were huge influences in those early part of my life from an Anglican perspective, though I didn't really know what that meant. To be quite honest, it was just a curiosity. But they were staples in the reading and the literature that we were reading and using in campus ministry. The importance of liturgy as a formation practice, just even though it wasn't a prayer book service, Redeemer was what I would call liturgy light in some ways. But I began to notice how people in the church utilize the Sunday liturgy as a shaping tool for their private liturgical practice, right? Their private devotional practice. And so, as I followed some of those leads, when it came time for me to plant a church, um, I just very self-consciously said, we're going to do a prayer book service. That's what we're going to do. The Protestant Presbyterian tradition felt a little too subjective to me, that we were just making it up on the fly, or we were living out of what subjectively had worked for us in certain contexts, or that we liked. And I thought, the Anglicans have thought a lot more about this narratively, and there's a plot line in worship. And so we very intentionally embraced at least the structure of a right to Eucharistic service in our church here from the very beginning. Other major influences for me were people like N.T. Wright. Certainly in the realm of biblical studies, he's done a lot to put the Bible on the map for many, many people. And I've benefited greatly from his work and his perspective, which sometimes you leak over beyond just the raw biblical information he's working with to some of the ways he would conceptualize worship, for example. And I've benefited from his influence greatly in that space. I became a fan of Rowan Williams early on, particularly some of the ways in which he was writing about the history of spirituality. Some of his work on the Desert Fathers and Mothers has been very important to me pastorally as I think about my own life as a clergy person and my engagement with people and their spiritual formation and development. So a lot of different threads have led there. About I guess maybe 7 years ago, started meeting with a spiritual director, and that was a very beneficial experience for me. He was an Episcopal priest here, who himself grew up in the Church of England, was trained at Oxford, and has since gone back to England. And another person that some of you probably know, Bishop Greg Brewer, was an influence for me as well, just in his friendship with me as I was planting City Church here. He and I connected pretty frequently about what I was doing. I think he was curious about, who's this Presbyterian doing Anglican things down in the city, and so he worshiped with us occasionally and expressed some interest in what we were doing. So I've been curious about the Anglicans from afar, and have sensed my own sort of conversion, if you will, in the direction liturgically and in the direction even around some of the emphasis around healing prayer, and some of those aspects of Anglican ministry have been a part of that for me, and certainly the biblical theological work of people like Wright have been very, very shaping for me. So when the opportunity came to come on over to you guys, I was pretty excited, honestly, and surprised, because I think I'd given up that, as an older minister and not connected to the Anglicans, I just thought, I'm going to live in my segment of the universe, the ecclesial universe here, and probably that's where I'll die. And it sort of resolved to that. And about that time, I found out about this particular opportunity and started connecting with individuals on the search team that I knew, and then got excited about this as a possibility.
What was it that excited you as you looked into this more?
Well, so just to be full disclosure, Dan Murata was on the search team, and I knew Dan, and I should honestly say probably I knew more of Dan than I knew Dan, because he had been a teenager in the church that I pastored in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I had some familiarity with him, and knew a couple of folks actually in the church in Richmond. A couple from our church had recently moved down there and had joined the parish there, and another friend of mine was on staff with Dan, was there as well. So when I heard about the job, someone had brought it to my attention, and I thought, well, I'll at least call Dan. I'll just call and find out what it is. And I did. And in the conversation with him, there was just such resonance that we shared some similar backgrounds and some similar commitments. And some of it was just seeing what the diocese was already doing in terms of church planting, and that many of these church planters felt familiar to me. They felt familiar, and there was a kinship that I sensed in them as we began to speak. And then as I entered the actual interview process, every time we had a meeting, I left the meeting with a strong sense that the Lord was saying, "Okay, if they open the door, are you going to go through?" And I thought, "Yeah, I think I will. I'll just keep walking as long as they're willing to walk with me." But every conversation was confirming. I mean, honestly, I think that's the thing that was so surprising to me, is that with every conversation I had, it was like, this is the right decision and the right conversations to be in. So,
That was very mutual. We felt the same thing on our end, and I one of the reasons I wanted to do this video interview with you is that it's been a joy for me and for all of us who have gotten to know you, just to see how God has brought us together, and thought that this might be a good way for the rest of our diocese to at least virtually meet you and to see what's in store for us. So as you transition in, you'll be, as I understand now, you'll be beginning part time, and you'll be going through the process of selling your home and buying another home here in the diocese and moving and getting situated. And then at some point, May, June, possibly be full time. Am I understanding that correctly?
yeah, I think I'm still working out some of the details around that with the church here as they transition, and then with Bishop John working out some of the details of the timeline. But the plan is that I've already started working a day a week, and as you transition off, I'll ramp on another day a week, and and then stay part time until it can become full time. My general thought is that that would be at the latest the beginning of May, and maybe a little earlier than that.
Good,
Some
good.
of it depends on, just some of the transitional features here, both with the church here and things that I still need to be available to them for, and then the move. Trying to figure that out. Just sorting out the sale of a house that we've lived in for 15 years, and
Well, Todd, thank you. Thank you for spending this time. Thank you for your commitment to the Lord Jesus, to the church, to church planting. It's going to be wonderful to work together with you. And I'm really looking forward to all that God has in store for us. So thank you so much.
thanks, Tom. I'm excited too. And just a note, I've appreciated the time you've been willing to spend with me and help me transition well. I feel like you've been working hard at doing that, and I've just enjoyed hearing your story and hearing a little bit more about church planting in the diocese. And it awakens and whets my appetite for doing more of it. So I'm excited for this transition to be underway.
Well, we feel the same way. And I just want to say to all those who are watching this video that you have a treat in store for you. And I encourage you to get to know Tuck as soon as you can.